1.3 Registers and Register Analysis and Overview. As noted above, we focus primarily on the register perspective in this course because it can be used to describe any text excerpt from any variety. However, the methodological techniques used for register analysis are also applicable to the genre and style perspective. In the present section, we provide an overview of register analysis, establish the foundation that will be used throughout the course. Then, in section 1.4, we provide a much fuller introduction to the genre and style perspective in comparison to the register perspective. 1.3.1 Register Analysis Situation Linguistic Features Function. In general terms, a register is a variety associated with a particular situation of use, including particular communicative purposes. The description of a register covers three major components: the situational context, the linguistic features, and the functional relationship between the first two components. Figure 1.1. Registers are described for their typical lexical and grammatical characteristics, their linguistic features, but registers are also described for their situational context. For example, whether they are produced in speech or writing, whether they are interactive, and what their primary communicative purposes are. One of the central arguments of the course is that linguistic features are always functional when considered from a register perspective, that is, linguistic features tend to occur frequently in a register because they are particularly well suited to the purposes and situational context of the register. Thus, the third component of any register description is the functional analysis. Register can be identified and described based on analysis of either complete text or a collection of text excerpts. This is because the linguistic component of a register analysis requires identification of the pervasive linguistic feature in the variety. Linguistic characteristics that might occasionally occur in any text but are especially common in the target register. It is these pervasive linguistic features that are clearly functional, as exemplified below. Situational varieties can also be described by analyzing language features that characterize complete text. Referred to as the genre perspective in the present course, genre features are not pervasive, rather they might occur only one time in a complete text. Often at the beginning or end of the text, they are also often. Situational context of use, including communicative purposes, linguistic analysis of the word in structures that commonly occur. Conventional rather than functional, section 1.4 provides a fuller discussion of the similarities and differences between the genre and the register. Perspective on situational varieties. The methodological process for analyzing register can be briefly illustrated by considering face-to-face conversation. The first step is to describe the situational characteristic of the register, focusing especially on characteristics that distinguish it from other registers. Face-to-face conversation requires direct interaction between at least two people who are together at the same time in the same place, at least electronically. Both participants must speak or the conversation would become a monologue. Furthermore, while many specific topics and purposes are possible, it is generally appropriate for a participant to discuss events, thoughts, and opinions related to their personal lives or something in the immediate context. The second step is to describe the typical pervasive linguistic features of the register. This step requires consideration of multiple texts from the target register to discover the linguistic features that are frequent across texts and not characteristic of only a single text. For example, three linguistic features are especially common in conversation: first person pronouns I and we, second person pronouns you and questions, Finally, the third step of a register and analysis is to interpret the relationship between the situational characteristics and the pervasive linguistic features in functional terms. To make the functions concrete, consider text samples 1.1, a typical passage of conversation. In this passage, the specific topic switched abruptly, but throughout the interaction, the participants are discussing their own thoughts, attitudes, and actions. With first persons pronouns pronouns I just found out, really want, I don't like, I think, and they use second person pronouns to address each other. Do you want? Did you guys? Questions are used as part of the direct interaction with each other, often incorporating the use of first and second person pronouns. These linguistic features are especially frequent in conversation because they have a functional relation to the situational context, which involves interaction between two participants, I and you. The characteristic of a register become easier to identify if an analysis contrasts two different registers. For example, in contrast to the speakers in a conversation, the author of a news report is not addressing a specific person, and there is no direct interaction between a specific reader and the author. It is also not normally relevant for the news author to describe her own personal feelings or other aspects of her personal life. As a result of these functional considerations, there are normally few first and second person pronouns and questions in news reports. These differences illustrate a key aspect of register analysis that we will return to repeatedly throughout the course. The characteristic of any individual register becomes much more apparent when it is compared to other registers. 1.3.2 More details about registers and registers analysis. The last question introduced the notion of register as a variety associated with a particular situation of use, including particular communicative purposes. The description of a register has three major components: the situational communicative description, the description of pervasive linguistic features, and the analysis of the functional associations between linguistic forms and situational context. A few points deserve further development here. 1.3.2.1 The situational characteristics of registers are more basic than the linguistic features. Registers differ in both their situational and linguistic characteristics. However, the situational characteristics are more basic. All speakers use language in different contexts, under different circumstances, for different purposes. Those patterns of behavior cannot be derived from any linguistic phenomena. In contrast, the linguistic differences among registers can be derived from situational differences because linguistic features are functional. For example, imagine what it would be like if the linguistic considerations were primary. In that case, you might be sitting on your computer and suddenly feel like producing a text with lots of pronouns, I and you, and lots of questions, and only later realize that such a text must occur in a conversational context. So you would go around looking for someone to have a conversation with. Obviously, this is not how communication works. Rather, you find yourself in a conversational situation, and because of that, you start to produce language with the linguistic features that are appropriate for a conversation. Module 2 will introduce a framework for the situation analysis of registers, including the role of culture in defining them. but even this brief example illustrates how registers are determined by their situational characteristics. Registers differ in their quantitative distributions of pervasive linguistic features, not the single occurrence of an individual feature. We will have much more to say about how to analyze the linguistic feature of a register in Module 3, but it is important to note from the outset that very few registers can be identified by the unique lexical or grammatical features. Instead, to carry out the linguistic analysis of a register, you must consider the extent to which linguistic features are used. In order to identify the linguistic features that are pervasive and especially common in the target register. For example, it is not the case that conversation always uses pronouns and never uses nouns, or that news reports always use nouns and never any pronouns and never any pronouns. Instead, both registers use both nouns and pronouns. However, conversations uses more pronouns and fewer nouns, while news reports use more nouns and fewer pronouns. In other words, the relative contribution of nouns and pronouns differs greatly between conversations and news reports. The linguistic analysis of registers is based on such differences in the relative contribution of linguistic features which are especially common and pervasive in some registers but comparatively rare in other registers. Registers analysis requires both situational and linguistic analysis, often applied cyclically. In a register analysis, both the situational components and the linguistic features are explicitly described. The functional interpretation then is based on a comparison of the situational and linguistic analysis. New register studies usually begin with at least some analysis of the situation. Characteristic. As Module 2 will explain in more detail, initial analysis of the situational characteristics can be important for selecting appropriate text samples to include in a study. However, often in a register analysis you will find that there are surprises resulting from the linguistic analysis. Certain linguistic features will occur more frequently or rarely than you expected. These unexpected linguistic patterns will often require that you reassess the situational characteristics of the register, especially with respect to less obvious characteristics like the communicative purpose. Thus, the process of register analysis is often iterative. 1.3.24 Register variation has a functional basis. The linguistic differences among registers are not arbitrary. For example, it is not sufficient to merely note that the language of conversation has many second-person pronouns and questions, because it is an accepted convention to use these features in conversation. Rather, register analysis always include description of the situational context and functional interpretation of why particular linguistic features commonly occur in the context. The functional associations between linguistic patterns and situational factors are the heart of studying register variation and are further discussed in Module 3. Registers can 1.3.2.5 registers can be identified on different levels of specificity. A register can be extremely general, like textbooks, but what about textbooks in linguistics? Or graduate level textbooks in social linguistics? In fact, any of these can be identified as a register. There is no single correct level on which to identify a register. Rather, it depends on the goals of your study, you may want to characterize the register of academic prose. A very general register, or you may be interested in only research articles, a more specific register within academic prose, or you might focus on medical research articles or even only the method sections of experimental medical research articles. All of these can be considered registers differing in their level of generality. As a register category becomes more specific, it is possible to identify its situational and linguistic characteristics more precisely. Module 2 will have much more to say about general versus specialized registers. At this point, at this point, it is simply important to realize that registers can be studied on many different levels of specificity. Register analysis must be based on a representative sample of text. Because a register analysis seeks to characterize a variety of language, not a particular text or an individual writer's style, it must be based on analysis of a sample of text selected to represent the register as fully as possible. In many places in this course, we exemplify what is known about certain registers with single short text passage. These texts have been carefully chosen to represent what previous research has shown to be typical in the register. At other places, we introduce some small case studies that show what you could do on your own, and we include many practice activities that ask you to work with a small number of short texts. Again, we have deliberately selected the text in these activities to be representative of the more general patterns of the target registers based on previous research studies. In fact, many intriguing results came from small register analysis. However, you should always remember that you cannot generalize a register from an analysis with a small number of texts unless you have supporting evidence from larger scale studies. We will have much more to say about representativeness and small versus large scale register analysis in Module 3.